Lila had always prided herself on her ability to trust. She believed in the simple, straightforward love she shared with Greg, her husband of 7 years. Their life together was not without its challenges, but they always overcame them. Together. They had a strong, solid marriage, one built on mutual respect, shared values, and, above all, an unwavering belief in each other. They had lived in their cozy suburban house for most of their marriage, but 2 years ago they made a dream come true. They bought a beautiful Victorian home on the outskirts of the city, an old house with grand windows and winding staircases that seemed like something out of a fairy tale. They worked tirelessly to renovate it, and it became a symbol of their shared ambition and love. The house represented everything they had worked for, the life they had dreamed of. But that night, as Lila sat down at her desk in the quiet of their study, something shifted. It was a small thing at first, nothing that seemed out of place. Lila had never been one to snoop. She trusted Greg. He had always been so transparent. He was working late again, and with a few quiet moments to herself, Lila decided to sort through some old emails. They had recently discussed refinancing the house, and Lila wanted to make sure she had all the documents in order for their upcoming meeting with the bank. She opened her email and quickly scanned through her inbox. It wasn't the email she was looking for that caught her attention, but a message that seemed entirely unrelated. It was from a real estate lawyer named Allison Barnes, sent just a few hours before. The subject line simply read, "Confirmation of property transfer, 1248 Oakwood Drive." Her heart skipped a beat. The address was their house, the home they had both put so much time, money, and effort into. Lila clicked the email open, trying to shake the unease creeping through her. The message was short and matter-of-fact, thanking Greg for his cooperation and confirming that the sale of the property had been completed. Lila's mind raced. She read the next sentence, her stomach dropping as she took in the details. The email outlined the terms of the sale. The property at 1248 Oakwood Drive has been sold for $10. As agreed upon by the seller, Greg Matthews. The email went on to describe the legal aspects of the transfer and mentioned a signing date, the previous afternoon. Lila felt as if the world had tilted beneath her feet. She reread the email several times, trying to make sense of what it said. For $10? How could that be possible? There must be some mistake, she thought. Greg had to have sold the house by accident, or it had to be some sort of mix-up. Maybe it wasn't their house at all. But even as the thoughts tumbled through her mind, a cold dread began to settle over her. This wasn't a mistake. She clicked the attachment to the email. A formal contract outlining the transfer of ownership. The contract seemed legal and proper, filled with jargon that made Lila feel like a stranger in her own life. The signatures matched Greg's handwriting, and the document appeared to be in order. But something felt deeply off. Who would sell their house for $10? Lila sat frozen, her mind racing as she tried to come to terms with what she was reading. There was no way Greg would sell their dream home, everything they had worked for such a pittance. But as she scanned through the document again, something else caught her eye. The buyer's name was listed at the bottom. It wasn't a company, as she had expected. It wasn't a bank or a real estate investor. The name was familiar, but Lila couldn't place it at first. She squinted, trying to recall. The name was Maya Simmons. The name echoed in her mind like a distant drum beat, but Lila couldn't immediately make the connection. She had heard the name before, but where? Greg had never mentioned anyone by that name. She tried to remember any past conversations, any strange occurrences, any clues she might have missed, but nothing came to her. The sound of the front door creaking open interrupted her thoughts. Lila quickly closed the email, her heart pounding in her chest. Greg had come home. Her mind was still swirling with the unsettling details she had uncovered. She needed time. She couldn't confront him just yet. "Hey, you still working?" Greg's voice was warm and casual as he entered the study. He smiled at her, a gentle grin that Lila had always found reassuring, but tonight it felt different. It felt like a mask. "Yeah, just going through some old documents," Lila said, trying to sound normal. She didn't want to raise suspicion. She needed time to think. Time to figure out what was really going on. Greg walked over and kissed her on the forehead, his usual way of greeting her when he came home late. "Anything interesting?" he asked, peering at the stack of papers on her desk. "Just some paperwork for the house," Lila replied, trying to act nonchalant. "We need to meet with the bank next week, so I thought I'd get everything in order." Craig nodded, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. He took a seat on the couch in the living room, leaning back with a sigh of relief as he stretched his legs. Lila, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She tried to go through the motions of their evening. Dinner, casual conversation, but every word felt like it was coming from someone else's mouth. She kept her eyes on Greg, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in her mind. He seemed like the same man she had married, the same man she had built a life with. But beneath the surface, there was something hidden, something she had never seen before. Once dinner was finished, Greg retreated to the study to check his emails. Lila hesitated for a moment, then made her way to the bedroom. She had to gather her thoughts before she confronted him, but it was hard to think clearly with so many questions racing through her mind. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of the email she had read. Who was Maya Simmons? Why had Greg sold their house to her? And, most importantly, why hadn't he told her? The more she thought about it, the more questions she had. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that this wasn't just about a house. It was about trust, about their relationship, about something far more complicated than she had imagined. Lila had always believed that Greg would never betray her. She trusted him implicitly, perhaps too much. But now, with the evidence of the sale staring back at her, that trust was shattered. The house, their home, had always been a symbol of their partnership, of their shared future. And now, Greg had taken that symbol and sold it off for $10. Lila's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Greg calling her from the other room. "Hey, Lila, you all right? You seem a little off tonight." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't let him know what she had discovered. Not yet. She needed time. Time to understand what had happened. Time to figure out how to confront him. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile as she stood up and walked toward the living room. "Just tired, I guess." But inside, she was anything but fine. Her world had just been turned upside down, and she had no idea what to do next. After the unsettling discovery of the sale, Lila couldn't bring herself to sleep. The house felt different now, almost foreign to her. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, felt like a reminder that her world was slowly collapsing, piece by piece. She had spent years building a life with Greg, a life she thought was rooted in trust and understanding. But the email she had uncovered had cracked that foundation, leaving her questioning everything. The days that followed were a blur of fragmented thoughts and half-spoken words. Lila went through the motions: work, dinner, brief conversations with Greg, but her mind was elsewhere. The details of the sale clung to her thoughts like a heavy fog. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the email with the amount: $10. It wasn't just the fact that Greg had sold their home, it was the amount. $10. That number seemed so absurdly small, as if he hadn't even cared enough to try and get anything out of it. Was it a mistake? A joke? Or had he been too careless to realize the enormity of what he was doing? What? Lila knew she had to get to the bottom of this, but she couldn't act recklessly. Greg had always been a careful man, methodical in everything he did. He was the type of person who double-checked everything, who made sure all the details were in order. He wouldn't have made such a huge mistake, not unless he had a good reason. And that reason? It was something Lila wasn't prepared to face yet, but it was something she knew she had to uncover. Over the next few days, Lila's suspicion grew into something more akin to a quiet obsession. She began researching the details of the sale. The real estate lawyer's name, Allison Barnes, was easy enough to find. Lila Googled her, hoping for some sort of explanation. The lawyer's firm appeared legitimate, with a well-established website and positive reviews from clients. There was nothing unusual about the firm, nothing to suggest that this was some sort of scam. But the more she dug into the lawyer, the more she realized that it wasn't the lawyer who was the issue. It was the sale itself. Lila started looking into the specifics of the transaction. She had a vague understanding of real estate law, enough to know that something about the sale didn't sit right. A sale for $10 couldn't possibly be legitimate unless it had been a gift or some sort of private arrangement. But even that seemed off. Why would Greg give away the house they had worked so hard for? Why would he sell it without even telling her? Her curiosity led her to another unsettling discovery. She found a social media profile for Maya Simmons. The woman's profile was public, a series of photos that depicted a glamorous lifestyle. Lila scanned the posts carefully, but there was nothing that stood out initially. It was only when she looked at the woman's friends list that her heart skipped a beat. There, in the list of Maya's friends, was Greg's name. He had liked and commented on several of Maya's photos. The comments were casual, innocuous, but they were there. Lila clicked through the pictures, looking for anything that could give her more insight into the woman who had seemingly entered her life without her knowing. Maya appeared to be in her mid-30s, with sharp features and a confident demeanor. She seemed successful, outgoing, and undeniably attractive. Lila had seen her type before. The type of woman who exuded a sense of self-assuredness that could easily captivate any man. But the photos, the smiles, the vacations, none of it gave Lila the answers she was searching for. She needed to know how long this affair had been going on. When had it started? How deep was Greg's involvement? And most importantly, what did Maya have to do with the house? The next few days were spent combing through every detail she could find. Lila was meticulous, taking notes, saving screenshots, making connections where she could. She dug through old emails, bank statements, anything she could find that might provide a clue. She discovered that Greg had been spending more money than he usually did. Frequent trips to cities she didn't recognize. Lila hadn't thought much of it at first. Business trips, he had said, but now those trips took on a different meaning. There were hotel receipts, expensive dinners, and flight itineraries, all pointing to the same destination. Every piece of the puzzle began to fall into place. But with each new discovery, Lila's heart broke a little more. One afternoon, as Lila was sitting in the living room, her mind racing through all the new information she had gathered, Greg came home early. He was carrying a large leather briefcase, his face etched with exhaustion. He greeted her with his usual, easy smile, but Lila couldn't bring herself to smile back. She had spent so many nights in the quiet of their home, researching, looking for answers, and now the moment had come. She had to face him. "Hey, babe," Greg said, setting down his briefcase and pulling off his jacket. "What's up?" Lila could feel the tension in her chest, but she pushed it down. She forced herself to speak calmly, methodically. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. Her voice didn't waver, but the words felt like they were being pulled from her throat, each one heavy with the weight of what she had discovered. "Sure, what's going on?" He sounded casual, but there was a slight edge to his voice, as though he sensed something was off. Lila stood up, folding her arms across her chest. She felt a wave of anger bubbling up inside her, but she kept it in check. She had to stay focused. "I found the paperwork for the sale of the house," she said, watching his reaction closely. Greg froze for a moment, his eyes widening. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "The house? What about it?" "You sold it," Lila said, her voice low. "For $10. To someone named Maya Simmons." Greg's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Lila could see the panic in his eyes, the way his posture stiffened. She could almost hear the thoughts racing through his mind. He had no idea how much Lila knew. He thought she was still in the dark, but she had already uncovered more than he could have ever imagined. "What the hell is going on, Greg?" Lila demanded. "Why did you sell our house? Why didn't you tell me?" Greg finally found his voice, but it wasn't the voice Lila was used to. There was no calm reassurance, no steady certainty. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice tight. "It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." Lila's eyes narrowed. She had heard the guilt in his voice, the desperation. It didn't sit well with her. She had already connected the dots. "Don't lie to me. You sold the house for $10 to a woman you've been seeing behind my back. Don't tell me that wasn't intentional." Greg's face contorted, and for a moment he looked like a man who had been caught in the act. I didn't want to hurt you," he stammered. I didn't know how to end it. Maya, she's someone I've been seeing for a while. I never meant to." Lila held up her hand, silencing him. She couldn't listen to his excuses anymore. "How long, Greg?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of accusation. "How long has this been going on?" "About a year," Greg confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want you to find out. I thought I could keep everything under control, but I was wrong. I made a terrible mistake." Lila stood there, her mind racing. She had always trusted Greg, always believed that they were a team. But now, everything she had thought was real seemed like a lie. The house, their life together, had all been a facade. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have ever imagined. She turned away from him, unable to look at him any longer. "You sold our home to her," Lila said, her voice trembling with the weight of the words. "For $10. That's how much our life together was worth to you?" Greg took a step toward her, his face pleading. "Lila, please. I never wanted to hurt you. I'm sorry. I was stupid. I didn't think things through." Lila shook her head, feeling a sense of finality settle over her. She didn't want his apologies, didn't want his regret. It was too late for that. The trust was broken and there was no going back. "I want you to leave," she said, her voice steady even though her heart was breaking. "I need space. I need time to figure out what I'm going to do." Greg looked at her, his face full of sorrow. But Lila didn't care anymore. She had learned the truth, and it was more than she could bear. Lila sat at the edge of their bed, her hands resting nervously on her lap as the quiet of the house enveloped her. The conversation with Greg had been a blur of anger, frustration, and confusion. He had begged, pleaded, apologized, but it had all sounded hollow to her. The trust they once had, the years they'd spent building a life together, had evaporated in the span of a few days. The pain she felt was no longer just a matter of betrayal. It was the weight of a future she had envisioned being completely shattered. She could still hear his voice in her head. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Lila." But how could she believe him? How could she trust anything he said after what she had uncovered? The house, their dream home, was gone. And worse, it was in the hands of someone who had been a part of their life. Someone he had kept hidden from her. Maya. The name felt like a poison on her tongue. She had seen her on social media, read about her adventures, and understood that she was the woman Greg had chosen over everything they had built together. Lila had to do something. She couldn't let Greg manipulate the situation. Not after everything he had taken from her. There had been moments when she considered just walking away, letting everything crumble, but she knew that wouldn't be enough. She had to reclaim her power, to take back what was rightfully hers. The day after their confrontation, Greg had left the house to give her space, as he put it. It had been a relief at first, but now Lila was left with the sobering reality that she had to make some difficult decisions. She wasn't sure where to start, But she knew the first step was to find out exactly what had happened with the house. How Greg had managed to sell it, why he had done it, and if there was any chance to reverse the transaction. Lila spent the entire afternoon poring over the sale documents again. She had already gone over the lawyer's details, traced the signature lines, and checked the dates. The contract had been signed in haste, signed with Greg's name on it, but there were things that didn't add up. The date was too close to their last joint decision about refinancing the home. There was a strange sense of urgency in the way the transaction had been executed. It wasn't like Greg at all. He was usually so careful, so deliberate. She reached for her phone and dialed the number she had found for Allison Barnes, the real estate lawyer. The call was picked up on the second ring. "Hello, this is Allison Barnes." "Hi, I'm Lila Matthews. I'm calling about the sale of my property at 1248 Oakwood Drive," Lila said, her voice calm, though her heart was racing. "I noticed some discrepancies in the paperwork, and I'd like to speak with you about it." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Lila could almost hear Allison's thoughts, wondering what this call was about. It was standard for someone to follow up on a real estate transaction, but Lila had a feeling that the lawyer had no idea the real reason for the inquiry. "Of course, Miss Matthews," Allison said finally, her voice polite but slightly guarded. "I'd be happy to help you. Could you please provide me with the specific details you're concerned about?" Lila hesitated. She could feel her pulse quickening as she prepared to confront the woman who had facilitated the sale, knowing she was speaking to someone who, whether intentionally or not, had played a role in Greg's betrayal. "I was concerned about the sale price," Lila said. "The house was sold for $10. Well, it doesn't make sense to me. It's not typical. Could you explain why that's the case?" There was a brief silence, followed by a soft sigh. Lila could sense that Allison wasn't used to being questioned about her legal work, especially in such a direct way. "Miss Matthews," Allison began carefully, "the transaction was conducted exactly as per Mr. Matthews' request. He signed all the necessary documents, including the sale agreement. The price was agreed upon as part of a personal arrangement between him and the buyer." Lila's stomach churned. A personal arrangement. That was the phrase that made her blood run cold. She didn't need to hear more to know exactly what kind of arrangement this had been. Maya had to be involved. But it wasn't just the price or the sale. It was the complete disregard for their life together. "Who was the buyer?" Lila asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Who exactly was Greg selling the house to?" "That," Allison said, her voice lowering slightly, "is confidential information. I cannot disclose that without Mr. Matthews' explicit consent." Lila could feel the frustration building within her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm his wife," she said, her voice cold. "I'm the one he's been lying to. I don't need consent to find out what's going on." There was another pause, this one longer. Lila could almost hear Allison trying to decide whether to press back or capitulate. In the end, the lawyer spoke again, her tone somewhat softer. "Miss Matthews," she said, "I'm afraid I can't give you more information unless Mr. Matthews requests it. But if you want to pursue the matter further, I suggest you seek legal counsel. I'm sure they can provide you with the support you need." Lila felt a sharp pang of frustration, but she quickly ended the call. It was clear that the lawyer wasn't going to offer any more help. She would need to take this matter to her own attorney if she wanted to move forward, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for that yet. She needed more answers, more clarity. The rest of the evening passed in a blur as Lila wrestled with her options. She couldn't just sit idly by while Greg wove his lies around her. He had already shown that he was capable of deceit, capable of betraying her trust in the most fundamental way possible. But what would be the next step? Confronting him again seemed pointless. The truth had already come out, and nothing he could say would change the facts. Lila knew that she had to start looking beyond just the surface of the issue. She had to understand the full extent of what Greg had done. Was this affair with Maya something that had been brewing for a long time? Had she been the only one in the dark all this time, or had there been other signs she had missed? The following day, Lila went back through old texts, emails, and social media exchanges between Greg and Maya. She had already done a cursory search, but this time, she wasn't just looking for the obvious signs of infidelity. She was looking for connections, patterns, moments when Greg's actions didn't align with the narrative he had always presented. What she found shocked her to the core. There were dates, hotel stays, trips, intimate messages. Greg had been seeing Maya long before he had admitted to it. There was no innocence to it, no casual encounter. They had been involved for much longer than Lila had thought. This wasn't a recent fling or a short-term lapse in judgment. It was an ongoing relationship, one that Greg had kept hidden with careful precision. The depth of it only became clear to Lila when she saw how seamlessly he had managed to compartmentalize his life, how easily he had continued to maintain his marriage while keeping Maya on the side. It was then that the full picture began to come into focus. The sale of the house wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated decision, part of Greg's way of escaping the life he had built with Lila. He had sold the house to Maya as if it was just another transaction, as if their life, their home, meant nothing. It was a final step in his effort to untangle himself from the life he no longer wanted. The house wasn't just a house. It was the symbol of everything he had been too afraid to face, and now, with it gone, there was nothing left to hold him back. Lila felt her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. She wasn't going to let him steal her future without fighting back. But she knew that in order to win, she needed more than just anger. She needed strategy, evidence, and most importantly, the strength to face whatever was coming next. And so, as the hours passed, Lila made a decision. She would take action. She would confront Greg one final time, but this time, it wouldn't be about forgiveness. It would be about reclaiming everything that was rightfully hers. Lila woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, but it didn't bring her any peace. It felt like a different world now. Her world had shattered, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. The house, the life they had built, it was all gone, replaced by a man who had chosen someone else over her. She had known this day was coming, the day she would have to face the truth and make a decision, but knowing it was one thing, and living it was something entirely different. She had spent the last few days planning, making phone calls, gathering information. She had contacted a lawyer, someone who could help her navigate the legalities of the sale and the betrayal. She knew Greg had left for work, though she wasn't entirely sure where he was going. He had barely spoken to her since their confrontation. He would check in every few hours, offering half-hearted apologies and begging her to reconsider, to give him another chance. But Lila was done listening. She had heard enough of his excuses. Now it was time to take control. She stood in front of the mirror. The reflection staring back at her was someone she hardly recognized. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but there was something else. A quiet determination. She had been broken, but now she was learning to rebuild herself, piece by piece. The last few days had been an emotional roller coaster. Lila had cried, screamed, and felt every ounce of despair. But with each passing moment, the anger and betrayal began to transform into something else. Clarity. She realized that it wasn't just about Greg's lies or the affair. It wasn't even about the house, though that felt like the final blow. What hurt the most was that she had invested so much of herself into a relationship that, in the end, was built on lies. She had given everything to a man who never truly saw her, not in the way she had thought. And now she had to face the reality that everything she believed to be true had been a carefully constructed facade. The first thing Lila did that morning was meet with her lawyer, a calm, collected woman named Evelyn Blake. Evelyn had been kind, understanding, and most importantly, thorough. She had already started reviewing the sale documents and was confident that there were ways to challenge the transaction. The sale was made under suspicious circumstances, Evelyn had told her over the phone. "We'll need to dig deeper, but you have grounds to contest it, especially if there was deceit involved." That was all Lila needed to hear. The sale wasn't just some mistake, it was deliberate, and it was a betrayal in its purest form. The house, the place where they had spent so many years together, wasn't just a financial asset. It was where Lila had dreamed of growing old with Greg. It had been a symbol of their love, of their future. To think that it was gone, sold for a mere token sum to a woman he had been hiding from her, was beyond anything Lila could comprehend. She arrived at the lawyer's office early, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Evelyn had already gathered all the necessary documents, including the signed contract and the email trail that led to the sale. They had also discovered something else. Greg had been using the house as collateral for a loan he hadn't disclosed to Lila. It was another layer of deception, another piece of the puzzle that painted a much darker picture of Greg's actions. As Lila sat across from Evelyn, she felt a sense of strength building inside her. It wasn't just about getting the house back. It was about taking back her dignity. She wasn't going to let Greg get away with this. She wasn't going to let him control her life anymore. "I want to fight this," Lila said, her voice firm. "I want to take him to court if I have to." Evelyn nodded. "We can do that. We'll start by gathering more evidence. We'll subpoena the sale documents, and we'll make sure Greg understands the consequences of his actions. But I want you to know that this won't be easy. There will be a lot of emotional strain, and it will take time. But if you're ready, we'll move forward." Lila took a deep breath. "I'm ready. I've been ready for a long time. This is about me now." As they discussed the next steps, Lila felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. For so long she had been adrift, lost in the pain of Greg's betrayal. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was taking control of her own future. She wasn't going to let him dictate her life. She was going to rebuild herself, piece by piece, even if it meant tearing apart the life they had once shared. It took several weeks for the legal process to unfold. Lila had to relive the pain of Greg's betrayal over and over again as she prepared for the court battle. She didn't want to drag this out, but she couldn't let Greg get away with what he had done. The sale was just the tip of the iceberg. There was so much more she needed to uncover. During this time, Greg had tried to reach out to her constantly. He called, texted, and even showed up at her doorstep, apologizing and begging for forgiveness. But Lila didn't want to hear it. She had seen the lies in his eyes, the way he had manipulated the situation to suit his own desires. There was no going back for her. She had dinner with a few close friends, people who had known her and Greg for years. They were supportive, understanding, but none of them could fully comprehend the depth of her pain. They all had their own opinions on what Lila should do. Some told her to walk away, to take the settlement and move on with her life. Others urged her to fight, to stand up for what was rightfully hers. But in the end, it was Lila's decision, and she was more determined than ever to see it through. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Lila felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. She wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but she knew that this was the moment where everything would come to a head. She had to face Greg one last time, and she had to do it in front of the law. When she entered the courtroom, her heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at Greg, who was sitting with his attorney on the opposite side of the room. He looked older, worn down by the weight of what he had done. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He had been trying to convince himself that everything would work out, that Lila would eventually forgive him. But deep down, he knew he had lost her, and he knew there was nothing he could do to fix it. The case unfolded slowly. Evelyn presented their evidence, and Greg's attorney tried to argue that the sale had been legitimate, that it was a personal transaction between Greg and the buyer. But the evidence spoke for itself. The house had been sold under dubious circumstances, and the financial details didn't add up. The judge listened intently, weighing the facts, but it was clear that the case was far from straightforward. As the hearing went on, Lila couldn't help but feel a sense of catharsis. This was her moment. This was her chance to take back everything Greg had stolen from her. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about taking control of her own life, reclaiming her dignity, and moving forward. Finally, after hours of testimony, the judge made her ruling. She ruled that the sale of the house was invalid, that the transaction had been made under fraudulent pretenses. She ordered that the house be returned to Lila and that Greg be held accountable for his actions. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. Lila had won. As the judge's gavel struck, Lila's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It wasn't over yet. There were still legal proceedings to follow, but the hardest part was behind her. She had taken back what was hers, and in doing so, she had taken back her life. That evening, Lila stood in the living room of the house she thought she had lost forever. The walls still held the echoes of their life together, memories of love, laughter, and tears. But now those memories felt like distant echoes of a past she was no longer part of. She had won, but she had also lost. Greg was no longer a part of her life, and the future they had once dreamed of was gone. But Lila knew one thing for certain. She was going to be okay. She was stronger than she had ever realized, and though the road ahead would be difficult, she was ready to face it. As she stood there, looking around at the house that was now hers once more, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't about the house, it wasn't about the money, or even about Greg. It was about taking control of her own story, reclaiming her power, and moving forward into a future that was entirely her own. The house might have been sold, but Lila had found something far more valuable: her freedom.